maybe we can start it. I'm ready time.
Okay, so I think that's a great idea. Let's just get started. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Jackie Yin, and I'm Danqing's actually a former colleague at Hong Kong U Business School. I'm also one of the co-authors of the paper to be presented today. But today our speaker is Dr. Danqing Wang, and I think a lot of people know Danqing as an assistant professor at the management department at Hong Kong UST. She's a well-published scholar. And as a young scholar, I think Danqing is one of the most passionate researchers I've seen. And she's published extensively on a lot of the top journals, such as the Academy of Management Journal, Journal of International Business Studies, and the Administrative Science Quarterly. And Danqing's research interests are focused on political sociology and corporate political strategy. So we share similar research interests. That's why we started this work together. Okay, so without further ado, Danqing, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and also good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar to share one of our latest research on political ideology and Chinese cross-border acquisitions in the US context. And also, thank you for IEMS to provide funding for this project. So when I would like, before I delve into the the real content of this project, I would like to share a little bit the background of this research. So actually, this research, the idea of this research has been conceived very early on, as early as in 2016. So that was almost 7 years ago. And the interesting fact was that the idea was created before the Trump administration, and also now the Biden's administration, which we know that who has started the anti-China and also the deglobalization process. But actually, this project was conceived before that process started. So at that time, before 2016, there were almost at the peak of the going global stage of Chinese companies, where we see a lot of Chinese companies went overseas, especially going to developed countries to acquire overseas assets as one of the global campaign pushed by the Chinese government, and that creates a lot of M&A activities on the global scale. So this is where the research was created under that context. So now I don't know whether given the new normal, that is the deglobalization and also the anti-China, the China-US conflict, whether the research is outdated or not. But I just want to share a little bit the backdrop of how the idea was created back then. So, okay, so now the topic of this research is on a community level process, and how the community level process impact the outcome of cross-border M&As from Chinese companies in the US. So the conventional wisdom, so we have during the globalization era in the past 20 years, we have, especially from the management and also the international business disciplines, we have a lot of research, especially on the emerging interest is from the cross-border M&A activities conducted by multinational companies from emerging economies. So we know that traditionally that was the developed countries, they had very capable multinationals, and then they go to developing countries for the sake of to get bigger market, to acquire natural resources. But in the new period that was started almost 20 years ago, there was the reverse trend. That is the multinationals coming from emerging markets such as China, Brazil, Russia, India, etc., like Tata, like Huawei, and many other companies. They go to developed countries in order to acquire, say, assets, say, capabilities. So that attracts a huge interest from from different disciplines. And however, the interesting thing that when they compare the cross-border outcomes is that the majority or a large portion of those cross-border M&As conducted by emerging multinationals, actually they failed in comparison with the relatively more successful rates of cross-border M&As conducted by developed multinationals. So in order to explain such a failure, there are conventional wisdoms. And the major perspective accounting for this kind of failure is from a so-called institutional-based view. And from this institutional-based view, they normally argue that because there's a huge institutional distance between emerging and developed countries in terms of the regulative context, in terms of the political context, so there are a lot of hurdles and difficulties for emerging multinationals to conquer that kind of large distances. And more importantly, especially from the political disputes and the conflicts between emerging and developed countries, those conflicts and disputes largely hinder the successful completion of cross-border M&As conducted by emerging multinationals. Say the most typical examples that we saw even before the Trump administration was Huawei has several attempts of acquiring telecom companies in the US, but all of the 3 attempts before 2016 has been denied by the US government. That was largely due to the regulatory differences and also the national security concerns arising from the political disputes between China and the US. So far, that was the major perspective explaining why many of those multinationals, emerging multinationals, fail to conduct cross-border M&As in developed countries. So all those existing research are very valid and relevant. However, what we are trying to do here is, I think the cross-border M&As are such a complicated and complicated processes. They involve multi-level agencies and also very different agents that have their diverse interests and motivations. So if we only focusing on the very macro level and the political regulative perspective, we may lose more interesting aspects. So this is where we really want to complement current research by bringing a more micro level processes, especially the in contrast with the current focus, which is more political. We really would like to bring or highlight more sociological and especially psychological processes into the cross-border M&A activities. And also another deficit that we find from existing research is that the current research, when they are comparing the institutional distances between developing and developed countries, they normally treat the institutional environment of the host countries as homogeneous and also neglecting the local variance of the institutional environments of the host environments. So we argue that we should pay more attention to especially to the level down to really explore the regional, the local variance and heterogeneities in perceptions and attitudes from the really local activities. Because by the end of the day, all these economic activities, they are really happening at the local level, at the local soil where there are local communities are involved. So this is the major deficit that we really want to address. And also at the same time, we want to bring the political ideology perspective to the M&A literature. Political ideology is a rising literature in management and strategy field. But in the current research, political ideology has largely started the domestic context. For example, to what extent the political ideology of CEO of the S&P 1,000 S&P companies will impact the company's, say, CSR practices, employee payment, or gender diversity, etc. It's all in the domestic context. But we want to extend the scope of the political literature, the political ideology literature, to cross-border context as well. So by addressing coming from these two angles, we bring together the different strands of literatures, and especially applying the role of political ideology in cross-border M&A activities. So the research question is straightforward. So we ask, how does political ideologies, how do political ideology of local communities influence the completion rate of cross-border M&As pursued by Chinese acquirers in the US? So the main target, the main research target is Chinese acquirers, and how the independent variable here is the political ideology of the local US counties. How does the political ideology of that local county may impact the completion rate of Chinese acquirers M&A activities in that particular county? And also the process for people outside the field of international businesses, we would like to highlight that we are starting a special period of the M&A activities. That is, we study all those announced M&A deals from the announcement to the completion. So there is still a lot of work to do after you announce that you have signed certain M&A deals with certain target companies, but there are still a lot of work to be done before the deal is really completed, before all the ownership can be transferred and all the really money can be paid to the target. So we are, and actually in reality, many of those M&A deals failed during this particular period. That is when the company really announced the M&A deals to the public, and more agents and more relevant stakeholders can be involved. So this is where the community is really can really play a role in during this kind of special period. So in addition to study the role of political ideology of the local communities, we also find several contingencies. That is, the factors that may intensify or alleviate the perceptions and attitudes of the local people. And specifically, we'll be focusing on the media perceptions, the media coverage and perceptions, and also the local community's economic condition that may further alleviate or intensify how the local people perceive the out-group companies. So that's the straightforward research question. So as I mentioned, the main research topic or the main research angle here is political ideology. So I would like to introduce some conceptual work on political ideology and how does it work. So I think to many people, the word of political ideology may be not new. It's a commonly heard concept. However, I think many people may understand the concept of political ideology in a relatively narrow way. That is, when we mention political ideology, many people may always think it is very political. So it is right in a sense. Political ideology indeed really decides or determines people's political behavior, such as voting to what party that you are supporting or what candidates that you are voting for. So indeed, political ideology plays a large role in determining people's political behaviors. However, relatively less known regarding the concept of political ideology is actually the fundamental process of political ideology is more than political. It's largely a psychological process. And this is where we really want to focus by highlighting the concept in this research. So it is not so much about political, but it is really about the psychological process underlying what kind of political ideology that you have. So by saying that, a quick definition probably is needed. So when we mention ideology or political ideology, normally we refer them to a set of assumptions, values, and beliefs about the governance of society in terms of the desirable goals and the means of achieving them. So what does this mean? So this means that we can understand political ideology like the world values, or the value system, how you think the society should work, what is right, what is wrong, or how you should achieve the goal of the society. Say, for example, in terms of economic growth or in terms of resource allocation, do you think that it is fair that the society is unequal, or you think it is unfair that the society is unequal? Or to put it a simple way, do you think resources should be distributed on an equal basis, or you think that the resources should be distributed based on your ability, which then by nature is not unequally distributed through different individuals? So this kind of example can be how you think how the society is working, or how the resources should be distributed, can be constitute one nature of one essence of political ideology. Or put it another way, that is political ideology. What kind of political ideology you have may influence the way how you perceive what is equal, what is unequal, and whether it is right to be unequal or not. So several characteristics of political ideology is it is relatively stable. So once you have certain kind of political ideology, the consensus is that it normally it is not changing too much, and it can you are normally sticking to that political ideology to a very constant basis. So this is related to the second characteristics of political ideology, is because political ideology sometimes serves as an information filtering channel. That is, after you have formed certain kind of political ideology, normally you only see the information that you want to see, and that information, the filtered information, normally just reinforce your existing political ideology. So it is very difficult for you to change, because you are normally the ideology that you have may be blind to information, or make you reluctant to receive new information that may be in contrast with your ideology. So this is how ideology is always relatively very stable, and when you have certain kind of ideology, it is always reinforced itself. So in every society, we can see a different kind of political ideology. And we normally, so in this study, in this current study, we follow the traditional trend. And in the US, the ideology is normally characterized based on the conservatism and the liberalism spectrum. So here, of course, we are just adopting a relatively simple characterization of political ideology. And in our context, we argue that. So I will elaborate in more details in the following slides. So here, just a general description of what describes the two ideologies is normally when you have a relatively liberal ideology, normally you are more likely to embrace social changes, and you are more pursuing equality of the society. That is, you think a liberal ideology will render you to think that the society should be equal. Everybody should be distributed with equal resources, to put it in a simple way. And in contrast, conservatives, if you have a relatively conservative ideology, they are more inclined to perceive the status quo, that is, do not easily accept the changes, and also they would think that the resources can be distributed based on your capability and competitiveness, so inequality is acceptable. So in the current studies, in the current political ideology studies, a lot of US studies have found that whether liberal or conservative CEOs will lead their firms in a very different ways in terms of forming very different policies regarding CSR, gender pay gap, supporting employee activism, pay gap among top managers, etc. So you can see ideology is not only about political behavior, but it can influence a large range of different kind of behaviors and also policies as well. So this is why political ideology is really a profound concept that is relevant to daily practices. So here, as I mentioned, we want to highlight political ideology as a psychological process. So to elaborate more, here we build on psychological research and studies to treat that political ideology as a motivated social cognition. That is, political ideology can provide a lot of motivations for you to understand the surrounding between you and the surrounding, and also how you relate yourself with other people. So especially there are two key aspects of that psychological processes. That is the need to manage uncertainty and threat as the meaning of existence. So in terms of the characterization between liberalism and conservatism, they have very different attitudes toward uncertainty and threat. And this is later will determine how they perceive Chinese companies, M&As in their community. So conservatives, if you have a relatively conservative political ideology, you are found to be more intolerant of ambiguity, and you are more in fear of loss and threat, and also you have psychological needs for order, structure, and cognitive closure. That is, conservative people are relatively risk averse because of the great need to preserve certainty and to reduce threat from surrounding changing environments. In contrast, liberalism are found to be associated with more openness to new experiences, cognitive complexity, and the tolerance of uncertainty. So those are both arguments, and also the arguments have been found with empirical supports in different contexts. So this is where we just borrow the arguments to lay out our predictions for later hypotheses. So here, taken together, that is, if you have a relatively conservative ideology, then that kind of conservative ideology will be associated with greater sensitivity to stress and a bias toward negative elements in external environments, because that kind of fear of loss can be more easily triggered by the unfamiliar elements from the environments. So here, one key feature that I would like to highlight or draw your attention is that we are not saying, the key point here is facing the same amount of uncertainty in the environment. Conservative people and liberalism people will receive with different extent. That is, given the same extent of uncertainty, conservative people or people with a relatively conservative ideology will receive that uncertainty with greater anxiety and a higher tendency to reject that kind of change. But relatively speaking, people with liberal ideology are more likely to embrace the change and are not so afraid of change. So this is not about different levels of the change in the environment. Rather, it is how you perceive the changes and how you respond to the changes. So this kind of different response are shaped by your ideology. So this is where we really highlight and emphasize in our paper, and we term it as a psychological process. So, and the second step to build out, to lay our arguments and the story and the theorization is, given that M&A activities are involving, especially cross-border M&A activities are involving two groups, that is us versus them. Say for US, the target, it is us, where the acquirer is from China, then it is our group. So the psychological process, the ideology will inform how different people with different ideology treat this kind of intergroup relations. So for conservative people, because they are afraid of changes, so they are more inclined to have stereotyping, prejudice, and hostility toward outgroups. Again, this is both a claim and also has been founded with empirical support from psychological literatures and also from sociological literatures as well. So as an argument, that is, they are more likely to possess stereotyping against outside group, because having stereotyping helps people conserve mental resources and avoid uncertainty and complexity. Then they can easily understand the outside group through an existing framework. No need to conceive, no need to consume a lot of mental energy to understand what is different and what is new. So they are more likely to resort to stereotyping to understand the outside, the surrounding world. And also, because they don't like changes, and relatively speaking, outgroups people are new. So they don't want to. They don't want to spend mental resources to understand what is new. So they resort to prejudice toward outgroups in order to avoid that kind of new cognition. So, for example, in the sociological research, people find that perceived threats and stereotyping often result in negative attitudes toward immigrants by people with a more conservative ideology. So, taken together, this is when we compare ideology between conservatism and liberalism, conservatism people are more likely to hold a negative attitude toward outgroup people, because due to their psychological needs to preserve status quo and to reject changes. But when you involving outgroup members into anything, that is, there is a highly likelihood of change and unfamiliarity, which is outside the comfort zone of conservative people. And in contrast, liberal people are more likely to embrace changes and also less likely to treat outgroups with prejudice or other unnecessary bias. So this is our all relatively speaking. So now we come to the key context of this paper, that is the cross-border M&As. So from the perspective of the local community. So now we aggregated that kind of psychological process from individual level arguments to the community level arguments. And we focusing on the community level and argue that conservative community overall, that is where there are so many, where the overall community are composed of conservative people, likely perceive greater uncertainty and threat from cross-border M&As pursued by Chinese acquirers. So those arguments are built on the previous arguments in the prior two slides. And are straightforward. So cross-border M&As are a very risky and complicated process where you involve the ownership transfer from one company to another. And it is furthermore than that, these two companies are coming from two different nationalities. So which triggers the process of the in-group versus out-group relationship. So when the acquirer is coming from another nationality, that acquirer is not necessarily very familiarized to the local people. So this kind of unfamiliarity with a foreign acquirer will hugely increase the perceived uncertainty from all the M&A processes, such as the post-acquisition, consolidation, restructuring, etc. So they are worried to say, for example, whether they will say Chinese after our company is acquired by the Chinese company, whether they will lay off a lot of local people, or whether they will pose, say, party control, or whether they will enforce us to work on Sundays as well. So then we lose our private time. So huge uncertainty and unfamiliarity arising from this kind of out-group members. And also, they had anxiety, much higher anxiety over the national and economic security, and concerns over the loss of values and conventions that we have been valuing for a long time. So again, the key point here is, given the same amount, given the same level, or facing the same Chinese acquirer, the conservative community and the liberal community will respond very differently due to their different ideology, which shape their different psychological processes. So even though the Chinese acquirer may impose the same level amount of danger, threat, and challenge, but conservative communities will respond more with more negative attitudes and perceptions, whereas relatively more liberal communities may perceive or interpret this kind of change probably in a less negative way. So we are not saying that they always respond in a positive or welcoming way, but we are just saying, comparing with a conservative community, they will interpret it in a less negative way. So this gives us the differences between conservative and liberal communities. And similarly, the M&A activities are actually a mutual process that is involving the target and also the acquirers. So from the perspective of the foreign acquirers, aka the Chinese acquirers, when they announce their deals to the public, and when they see that the local communities have created so much criticism and hostility attitudes, so they may hesitate to go forward as well, because during the final negotiations of strategic and administrative activities, all this anticipated new information could result in renegotiation. So for example, what about if the conservative communities have a huge resent in terms of the workers' rights, and they really demand forming the labor's union, which may not necessarily was in the original deals, then that will create more costs for the acquirers to deal with the labor union, one more stakeholder. So if that is the case, then the Chinese acquirers may probably will think it twice, and they will also be hesitate to put forward the process. And also the local resistance may change the acquirer's calculation of risk and returns. So for example, if they see there's a huge criticism and resistance from the local community, which may result in departure of key personnel, such as the local key personnel from the local community. And also, what about if they later on would like to transfer some technological patents from the US to China, that also will result in resistance and refusal. Those create additional costs and burden, and also the risks for the acquirer side. So in that is the case, all this mistrust between the acquirer and the targets may complicate the renegotiation process. And the acquirer may be reluctant to go forward as well. So from both perspectives, from the local communities and also from the perspectives of the acquirers, when they perceive there is a large resistance from the relatively more conservative communities, probably the deal is more likely to be abandoned due to this kind of more conservative attitudes toward out-group members, aka the Chinese acquirers. So our H1 predicts that Chinese M&A deals are less likely to be completed in conservative communities than in the liberal communities in the US. And largely, so here we are not talking about any national level regulative interventions or due to national security concerns, but just due to very micro level psychological processes arising from the ideology, those M&A deals are also more likely to be abandoned as well. So that's the main hypothesis regarding the role of political ideology. And then we will create two more conditions that may hasten or alleviate the concerns. threat and challenge. So one is about the media report. So we know that in developed countries, the media plays a very important role in terms of information disclosure and monitoring. So we argue that the media reports may further shape the way how the local community perceive foreign requirers. But the media reports the effect may be different in terms of two aspects. One is the amount of report, the other is the tone of the media report. So the amount of report in our case may not necessarily doing any benefit towards the foreign acquirers. And we argue that the more media report, regardless of its good or bad, such increased visibility will make the perceived threat more salient in the community. So that is due to how the ideology is working. So as we mentioned, the ideology will channel information to, or filter the information by focusing on what you want to see and what you really want to hear. So if you always hear the foreign acquirer, no matter it's good or no, no matter it is good in a good or bad way, they will reinforce the us versus them mentality. And also, it will always increase the perceived uncertainty and the threat arising from concerns over economic security and loss of values and conventions. Because you're always hearing the name of the foreign acquirers, that will really reinforce that the Chinese are coming to take over our assets. So that kind of mentality will reinforce the threat and the anxiety triggered by the M&A deals. So we argue that the negative effect of the conservative ideology on the completion rate of Chinese M&As will be strengthened if the acquiring firm has received larger US media coverage before the deal announcement. So that is the media, the amount of media report is bad for foreign acquirers. On the other hand, if the foreign acquirer have received relatively positive tone in the media, that will attenuate the negative attitude. So for example, the positive reports regarding either CSR activities or sustainability activities or financial activities, say that will save the jobs, keep the jobs alive in the local community, such a very positive tone enhances the firm's legitimacy in the eyes of local constituents. And also it will create positive image building prior to the deal announcement. So in comparison with the amount of the media report, the tone of the media report will do a favor to the foreign acquirers. So the negative effect of conservative ideology will be dampened if the acquiring company has received more positive US media coverage. So that's one of the contingencies regarding media report. Then another contingency that we are interested in, and also is very related to the local communities' attitudes and perceptions, is regarding the local conditions, the local economic conditions. So as we have argued that conservatives are always more sensitive to threats and bias toward negative elements in the external environments. So given the same amount of unemployment rate and also the economic stress, conservative people are more likely to trigger negative negative attitudes and perceptions toward outsiders. And they sometimes may even attribute such economic stress to the outsiders due to this negative stereotyping and prejudice. So a sociological and a psychological research has found that when there are import competition posed by Chinese companies, those local, we can see a tendency of rising support for nationalism parties in both the US and also the Europe. That is, a threat from out-group members will trigger a kind of support for the nationalism sentiment. So we argue that when the local community is suffering economic stress, such negative attitude from the conservative communities will even more strengthened in comparison with the liberal communities. This is exactly due to the different response level by conservative ideology versus the liberal ideology. As we argue that the conservatives are more likely to respond to the negative element of the environments, and economic stress represents a very salient signal of the negative element in the environment, and they are more likely to channel that kind of negative element to their negative attitudes towards outsiders. So that is, they are more likely to resist the M&A activities conducted by Chinese companies. So this is the overall argument of the paper and the theoretical arguments of the paper. Now I would like to speak quickly on the empirical part. So all the samples. So we collected all the Chinese listed companies announced the deals in the US from 2000 until 2016. So when the idea was created, and also that was the before the 2016. That was the before Trump's election. So in our data set, we cover several elections every 4 years. So we had elections, and we quote the election results as the county level presidential election popular votes from each county. So we are focusing on the popular vote rather than the electoral vote. So in total, we collected 209 deals. Announced deals from Chinese companies in the US among that period. And also we collect news reports from multiple different sources. And also the county level, we also collected county level data from the US Census and the UN Commerce database. So overall, that is why thanks for IEMS for the funding support, then we are able to collect a large amount of data for this research. So measurement, deal completion is just a dummy variable that is recorded as 1 is completed and 0 otherwise. So county conservatism, following tradition literature, we are here indeed using their political behavior on voting to measure their political ideology. Of course, it is never the ideal measure for ideology, but it has been used in a very robust and consistent way in multiple disciplines, and it shows a high validity to measure people's underlying ideology. But of course, it's never be the most perfect measurement. So we use the voting percentage for the Republican candidate for the popular vote during the presidential election in 2000, 2004, 2008, and 2012. Again, before the 2016 election. So for all the deals that happens afterwards, we use the previous election result to code as whether this is a conservative county or a liberal county. So moderators, we measure report amount as the number of media reports about the acquiring firm in the US media. So it's just count of the news reports, regardless of the tone. It's just a count, simply count of the media reports that mentioning that regarding the acquiring company in the US media, both national and local. And then the positive media reports is coded from the data set. It's called event sentiment score. So it is, we just imported the data directly from the database. It is ranging from 0 to 100. And if the report is coded above 50, which means which was interpreted as a positive tone by the database. So it's all based on media US coverage 1 year prior to the focal deal announcement. Then the economic distress is measured as a county unemployment rate in the focal year. So we argue that if the county has a higher unemployment rate, then it is undergoing higher economic distress that will further intensify the threat perception by the community, by the conservative communities. So we use a probit model and clustering by the state. So it's a deal level analysis. For the controls, we control for firm level factors, county level, deal level, and also we control for deal yield dummies. So all the relevant factors that previously studies have been shown to predict the deal level success, and then we control for them, such as whether the acquirer have foreign experiences, whether it is state-owned companies, whether the company, whether the target is in high tech, which will trigger more national security concerns, and also what's the deal attitude and also the payment method, etc. So all the relevant factors that we have controlled in this model. So that's the results. I think we have I will speak for 2 more minutes, and then we can wait for Q&A. So we can see that the conservative ideology has a relatively negative, has a significant and a negative effect on the deal completion rate, which means the Chinese acquirers are less likely to complete their M&A deals in more conservative communities. And then model 3, 4, 5, showing our moderators or interactions. So that is, however, such negative attitude is more intensified if there is more amount of report, but the negative attitude, the negative effect is reduced if the acquirer has more positive media tones, that is by proxied by ESS, and the negative, sorry, the negative effect is also intensified if the local community has higher economic stress. So in general, all our predictions are supported by the empirical analysis. So last, we acknowledge that there could be endogeneity issues. That is, some unobserved county level factors can affect ideology and M&As at the first place. So for example, there are some counties are just very attractive to foreign acquirers, whereas that attractiveness may also contribute to it become a conservative community at the first place, which we don't know. So in order to address that kind of endogeneity, we use an instrumental variable approach. That is, we coded data on average county level maximum potential cotton yield from the slavery period. So from historians that research, we know that the slavery practice, especially in the southern states of the United States, links to a high level of cotton production, and that kind of high slavery practice also predict contemporary Republican votes. So using the cotton yield in the historical period can be a valid exogenous variable that may predict whether the county is a conservative county or not in the contemporary period, but may not necessarily related to any Chinese multinationals activities, unless it's really in the agricultural industry. But I think we don't have many examples in that sense. So after the two-stage residue approach, the instrumental tables produce consistent results as our main table. So we will not repeat the results here. So finally, several words on the contribution, then we can go to the Q&As. So we really contribute to the cross-border M&A research by integrating more psychological mechanisms, whereas current research is always focusing on more political and regulative processes. And also, we really bringing the within country level heterogeneities of perceiving and accepting foreign acquirers. So we can see even within the US, where overall there could be a potential anti-China attitude, but we still see a large variance. That is, the more conservative counties can have even more hostility towards Chinese acquirers. And finally, we extend the study of political ideology to the context of cross-border M&A research. So it's the first step to apply the concept of political ideology in the international context. So that's the major report of this study. So thank you so much for your attention. And now we welcome questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Danqing, for this great presentation. So now is our Q&A session. And so I'm sure Danqing will be happy to address any comments or questions or feedback from the audience. So Danqing, I think there is a question from Yihu. Would you like to address that? Is in the chat box. Can you see that?
Okay, so yes, so I think it's a good idea to have some real case study. I think there are a lot of examples actually in the news report. So in our serialization, I think we have applied some real cases, but the research methods alone for this research is more quantitative side rather than qualitative. So case study is not the major research methods that we're using, but of course, including concrete examples from the real companies in our data set is a good idea to further illustrate the process. And we have seen that some relevant examples in the news report as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you. Is there any other question from the audience? Okay. I think here's another question from Yi Ying.
I think for the first one is an empirical question. I think from the data set, it will disclose clearly where the deal will be taking place. So this is where we determine the location of that deal is happening. So we use that information to code the ideology of that specific location. So this is where it is disclosed by the deal itself or by the target company itself. So we do not decide, but they provide that information, and then we code based on that information. For the second question is actually very interesting. So I think for now, we do not control for that, but that definitely will play a role. I think that will be a very interesting future study we can consider definitely as an extension. So far we do not consider that, but it is definitely a very interesting avenue to study, to explore.
Yeah. Okay. So any other question? Yeah, just one quick comment maybe to add on to what Danqing has said. I think if you take a quick look at the literature review we've done in this paper, you can see actually some of the previous studies have indeed looked at the CEO ideology as a predictor of the firm's strategy and outcome. Just that in this study, I think what we were what we are intending to do is to actually look at the local community, which is something that the literature hasn't really looked at. But I think it's definitely an interesting idea to also look at the CEO's own ideology, or at least we could take that as a control variable. Maybe I guess just a quick thought on this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to see what about, say, if a CEO is very liberal, and then but the company is located in a very conservative county. So how will he or she react, right? So that will create tension. So that definitely is very interesting to see, and I'm sure that in that case, a case study is a very useful way to disentangle the conflicts. between the different levels of ideology. So that is why ideology, the literature on political ideology is still very promising, because it's still emerging, and that a lot of interesting research ideas can be generated through this angle.
Exactly. So this is a very exciting area, and this it's just there hasn't really been a lot of studies on this topic. Yeah, is there any other question from the audience or any comment?
I think the audience can also turn on the camera to ask directly, or I don't
know. Yeah. You don't have to really type your question. You can just ask directly. Okay. So if there's no more question, I guess we can just call it a day.
Sure. So yeah. So I think if you are still interested and I want to discuss more, feel free to send me or my co-authors email, and we will be happy to discuss more offline. And again, thank you for your time and attention and your interest in our research, and also thank you for IEMS for providing the funding and the opportunity to do this research.
Okay, thank you, Danqing. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Jackie.